people popping in. And if you're all okay, Denise is going to record this because we like to put a recording up on our website so folks who are otherwise exposed on a Friday.
Probably no longer state of the art, but I really did like that.
And Denise, if you're going to stay on,
Thanks for everything.
Yeah.
Denise, mute your thing if you're going to stay on because we can pick up Debbie in the background. There we go. So let me introduce Becky Darner, who we are very proud to claim still in the School of Biological Sciences under CAST, but Becky is also the director of CeMaST. And I came to know Becky a few years ago and then really got to know her on the, she served on the CFSC, and that's when I really became aware of how invested she is in inclusive teaching. So I asked Becky if she would spend a little time talking about that with us today. So there you go, Becky.
Thanks. Thanks for that introduction. So I'm happy to be here, even though I'm just in my office in my home. But I'm happy to see everyone who is here because it's, you know, that time of the semester where we start to get really busy and kind of check out a little bit because Thanksgiving's almost here. So thanks for coming. So I am just going to talk at you for like 12 minutes, and then hopefully the rest of today will be discussion. But I'm going to start off with a little bit of history. Does anyone recognize this guy? Does anyone know who he is? Feel free to unmute yourself and just say it.
It's Gregor Mendel.
Gregor Mendel.
Yes, I'm so impressed. I was like, you know, I'm not sure if any biologists are going to come. And so this might actually be like people who may not know who it is, but it like warms my heart. So yes, this is Gregor Mendel. He lived in the 1800s. He's considered the father of genetics. He experimented with pea plants as depicted in this painting. And he identified patterns of inheritance that exist across seven different characteristics in pea plants. And these patterns kind of became the fundamental laws of inheritance. And some of those patterns or some of those laws, what he discovered was that inheritance traits are discrete. So you may recall from way back when in biology that seeds can either be smooth or rough, or plants can either be tall or short, or flowers can be either purple or white. So if you mate purple flowers with white flowers, you don't get lavender flowers, you get purple or white, depending on what is dominant. Does this ring a bell? Just give me a thumbs up and Zoom. That all sound okay. So he also basically determined that genotype determines phenotype. And so, as I was saying, if you have big S, it might be smooth. If it's big S, little s, it's still smooth because smooth is dominant. And I forgot to look that up. Rough might be dominant. Biologists on the call, feel free to correct me. And then if it's little s, then it would have the recessive. So all of this work was basically hidden for the rest of his life. He made these discoveries, and then nothing was ever done with that work, and it was rediscovered in 1900. Okay, so that's a bit of history. Now, does anyone know who this guy is? Anyone? I can't see anyone, so you have to, or I can only see like 5 of you, so you'll have to like unmute yourself.
I don't know who it is, but he just looks kind of unhappy.
He does. He looks super grumpy, and he has good reason to be grumpy. So here, this is Raphael Weldon. He went by his second middle name. I think it's William Frank Raphael Weldon. He was a statistician. He is considered the founder of biometry, which is the application of statistics to biological problems. And he actually proposed, notice he's a contemporary of Mendel, and he was a little bit younger, but he proposed alternative ideas about inheritance that were based on his statistical analyses of populations. And so what he claimed was that the characteristics that we see are actually a result of a myriad of interactions. They're super complex between the inherited elements. We didn't have the word genes yet, but that's what he was referring to. Genetic variation, influences from the developmental environment, and also chance. And so he had these conflicting ideas, these ideas that conflicted with Mendel. So that brings us to like 1900. We have these two conflicting ideas. We have Mendel over in one corner, discrete inheritance, genotype determines phenotype. And then on the other side, we have Weldon. Inheritance emerges from complex interactions between genes and in the environment. Now, I just want you to take a moment and I want you to like pick your favorite trait about yourself and ask yourself, did that trait result from Weldon's ideas of inheritance or Mendel's ideas of inheritance? Feel free to unmute yourself and say whose explanation better explains your favorite trait. Okay.
Becky, is somebody from the social sciences side, I would definitely side more with Weldon. Also has a little bit to do with that he has a blue glove versus a red glove.
Okay. I didn't even think about that. All right, well, I will just share something about myself. Okay, I happen to have quite the genetic predisposition for having high cholesterol. And so, you know, in my early 30s, I started having like slightly elevated cholesterol. And I was concerned about this because I'm like, I'm only like 32. I shouldn't have high cholesterol, right? And so I went vegan, and now my cholesterol is beautiful all the time. I get so much praise from my doctors. It's awesome. And so, yeah, you could probably tell where I fall on this too. It turns out that all of the, well, okay, I'll get there before I go on. I'll tell you who this guy is. This is William Bateson, sorry. He was a student of Weldon. He did not like biostats. He had beef with Weldon. And so he ended up becoming what historians call Mendel's bulldog, because he essentially had beef with Weldon and he was like, you know, whatever he says, I'm just gonna argue with it. And so this whole like alternative explanation of inheritance, I think it's bogus because it's based off of your biostatistician ideas. And so he would essentially argue with Weldon all the time. And then this debate was also occurring in the context of the eugenics movement. This was happening during the early 1900s. And if you're not familiar, the eugenics movement basically, its foundational idea was that we can and we should use our knowledge of inheritance to selectively breed a better human race. And of course, what was considered better was the white race. And so it was essentially an argument for white supremacy. And if it's not clear, it was supported by Mendel's ideas, not by Weldon's ideas, because they were really making the claim that we need to be breeding people who have high IQ and, you know, have all of these traits that we know now to be socially constructed. We also know that race itself is socially constructed. And so, you know, the eugenics movement really found Mendel's ideas to be super useful for supporting their agenda. So, Weldon suffers an untimely death in 1906. So, anyone want to take a guess as to who won this debate?
I would guess Mendel for the time being, just because I remember learning that when I was in grade school, and Weldon I had never heard of.
Yeah, well, it's still the same. So today, when we teach genetics, we teach Mendel as the father of genetics. We never mention Weldon. That's why no one knew who he was. Mendelian inheritance explains a very small percentage of genes. It's not that what Mendel discovered was wrong. It's just that it only applies to a tiny fraction of genes. And in fact, Mendel himself looked at a myriad of traits across, you know, all the different traits in pea plants. And he focused in on these 7 because they followed the same pattern. And he kind of ignored everything else because he couldn't explain it. Weldon's ideas cohere better with our most recent discoveries of inheritance, and they explain the vast majority of what happens with most genes. And yet, in a typical biology class, like an introductory biology class, we have 1 to 3 lectures that are committed to Mendelian genetics, and we might spend 20 minutes to 1 lecture or so on the exceptions to the rule. Mendel's genetics Mendelian genetics are considered the rule, and then everything else is considered the exceptions. But in reality, when we look at genes, Mendelian genes are the exceptions to what the majority of genes are doing. So I also
sorry, can I add a comment here? Sorry for I think it's well, what you probably are referring to is that a lot of like quantitative traits vary not in discrete ways, but usually that can still be explained by a combination of many genes that are inherited, like Mendel would predicted. But still, they, of course, all of them would, or almost all these traits would also be affected by the environment. So it's, I think that, well, most genetics courses probably would teach both of those, and still, like, the Mendelian inheritance would be would explain how most traits are inherited, except that you'd have to consider many genes at once rather than a single gene.
Yeah, so that's a good point. That it's like when we look at a single trait. So this idea of Mendel's, where genotype determines phenotype, we know now that, you know, for many traits there are multiple genes that are contributing to that phenotype. And so, you know, as a result, like if you were to look at it on the scale of individual genes, the inheritance might follow that Mendelian pattern. But then when you look at the trait like globally, then you see that multiple genes are contributing to that trait. So things like heart disease risk, remember I referred to my cholesterol level, things like heart disease risk are one of those things, right? Multiple genes affected, and all of those genes undergo a process of gene expression, right? And that gene expression process is the turning on and turning off of genes as you know, given the environmental cues that they get. And sometimes, usually in the case of like heart disease, the environmental cues are physiological cues. They're not like necessarily out in our environment. So that, I mean, that kind of demonstrates my point, Kierman, is that what Mendel found was not correct, okay? But yet it's, sorry, it wasn't incorrect. It just wasn't complete. And what we know, with like going to this slide, is that when we teach Mendelian genetics as kind of the majority of the genetics instruction, we find that it really enhances ideas of genetic determinism. And genetic determinism is not not scientifically accurate, but yet with such a heavy focus on Mendelian genetics, we end up reinforcing this misconception. And in fact, Donovan and colleagues found that when we reinforce this misconception of genetic determinism, we actually enhance racist beliefs among our students. And he has two really foundational papers where he talks about, he literally does a randomly controlled clinical trial and compares two methods of genetic instruction, both of which teach Mendelian genetics, but with a difference in emphasis, and then measures belief in racist ideas, but also this misconception of genetic determinism. And so, I mean, I think, does anyone want to take a stab at why I share this story to kick off our discussions? Okay, I'll just
have you noticed it in your own class as well? Is it your classes as well? Is that part of it?
No, actually, I mean, certainly genetic determinism. Genetic determinism is an idea that I think anyone who teaches biology, we have to constantly kind of, when we speak with our students, we notice that this is a very common misconception. The reason I share this story, though, is really to just demonstrate how the scientific knowledge that becomes our educational canon, you know, while science itself does not deal with sociopolitics or history, our knowledge, our scientific knowledge, has been influenced by history and sociopolitical events over the course of history, like as it's been constructed. And so I often hear from my scientist colleagues that, this diversity and inclusion push or anti-racist education, that's not relevant to me because I teach physics or I teach biology. I don't teach history. But I share this story to demonstrate how even scientific knowledge is culturally laden. And the information we teach and how we teach it is a result of cultural processes that have occurred over the course of history. So we could also argue that, I guess one could argue that, oh, well, that happened in the past and that doesn't happen now because we're not, working within the eugenics movement. But I just want to point out this awesome article that was just published like a week and a half ago in Science. And it talked about how Charles Turner, who was an animal behaviorist from he was active in like the early 1900s, but over the course of his career published like 70-something articles. And he actually put forth lots of ideas that are like re-emerging now as the burgeoning field of investigating animal personality. But he actually proposed very similar ideas almost 100 years ago, and it was essentially ignored at the time, probably because having something to do with the fact that he was African American. But also even now that those ideas are considered valid, he's not cited. He's been forgotten to history. And so my point is that these this process through which fields and disciplines go through in order to decide whose ideas are valid to fold into the fabric of the discipline and whose ideas get ignored, that is a socio-political cultural process. And I think perhaps we need to reflect on how the knowledge of our discipline came about, even if we are a scientific discipline. So I have a few discussion questions. I'm just going to put them up there and then we can pick from them or talk about something else. Totally up to you what we talk about. Okay, so.
Becky, may I suggest that, can you just using slideshow? This is a little bit challenging to read.
Sure.
Thank you.
Like, is this what you mean?
No, actually, on the lower side, you can, if you do a slideshow, so that will only show the PowerPoint slide.
Oh,
so
have you been seeing this the whole time? I'm sorry. I thought that you had. Okay. Sorry about that. I wish that someone would have said something because I totally thought that this is what you had been seeing the whole time.
Thank you. This is great.
Okay. Alrighty. So here are some discussion questions. We can talk about these or we can talk about others. So the first question I have is, do we need to be teaching students not just the knowledge of our discipline, but also where it came from, how it came about, including the knowledge that was once ignored but now found to be relevant or correct?
If I could say something about that, because that kind of piqued my interest, it actually kind of follows with a different question I have. You say, should we be including knowledge that was once ignored? My question is, since our biases really influence what stories and experiences become our truth, I even wondered how hard is it as a scientist to find these stories and knowledges that were ignored?
Yeah, I mean, that's my second question. To what extent is it our responsibility to investigate and find them? And then how do we do that?
I'm not coming from a scientific perspective, but more from a historical perspective. I would think it would be really, for me, knowing the context of something, whether we're talking about a literary text or some kind of scientific knowledge, I would think knowing the context for it and how it's morphed over time, or parts have been ignored or brought to the fore. I think that would be, really interesting. I was also wondering, in terms of talking about Mendel, in say like grade school or something, I was wondering whether, because it's simpler to understand, whether that's why it may be foregrounded there, you know, in the sense that I remember like an assignment where you go home and find out what color your parents' eyes are, your grandparents' eyes, and then you can say, oh, look, well, I got my blue eyes from my grandparents because of this.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think that as students get older and discover how complex the world is, I would think that this would make it actually much more interesting than just, well, here's this and this is what you should know.
Yeah, I'll add something. And I'm not sure if this is, if I'm being picked up or not here. But one thing in the teaching of physics and astronomy, I've always felt it was really important to give the historical context and to explore some of the blind alleys that we've wandered down, things like the caloric theory in physics, because it shows that physics is a process and an evolving process. It's not just, science is not just a collection of facts, it's a process. And the only way you can really understand that is by seeing the fullness, the history of the scientific endeavor.
Mhm.
Jump
I'd
on this.
say
Oh, sorry, Ben. Go ahead.
I say, yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, it's sometimes difficult to balance content, you know, in classes versus this perspective, this history and philosophy perspective. But I think it's really important. So I try and do it almost every class. And I think there's a I think it's early 2000s paper by Manenschein in biology and philosophy that really goes over like why history and philosophy of science is important. And I think it goes to the idea of self-improvement, right? So the history illuminates the science and makes us better now. Efficiency, right? By knowing what's been gone through before, we avoid repeating the past, we learn from our mistakes. Whereas if you ignore what was done previously, then you may just go around in circles. Also provides us perspective, and I think that was one of the points as well. Gives us some judgment and clarity to that, and makes science better through that. And imagination, and then just promotes public understanding of science and how science works, right? So I think, and I think they were most of the points that were brought up in that paper, but I actually put that often at the front of, okay, we're going to go over this history and philosophy of this particular field, but this is why as well.
Ben, if I could just interject just on that point, and then I know TY had something to say, but both our philosophy department and our history department, Ross and Tony, I know you're on this call, have an interest in the philosophy and the history of science. And so this might be something we want to explore at ISU at some point.
I'm thinking in terms of like gen ed or something. Maybe this would be a kind, you know, especially for students who, you know, think, okay, I have to take intro to whatever science just because that's part of gen ed. And is this another way of letting students know about science that's, you know, a little different perhaps from the way we currently offer gen ed? But, you know, I would think that people might say, you know, this is really interesting. Maybe I would want to take more courses if I found out like all of the discussions rather than, okay, we do this experiment, we find out this, we do this other experiment, we find out that.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly why the history department is very much in favor of the history of science position, which we voted to make that our top priority in hiring for exactly what we're talking about in this discussion here, is that it and the idea of like having students in the sciences, it might be worthwhile to consider them even making it a requirement to have them take a history of science class because of the entire, context of understanding the generation of the knowledge that they are working in their major. I mean, it would just provide such an enriching, wider perspective for them. To me, it represents interdisciplinary work at its best, really, and it helps our students the most.
Amen.
with regard to, from the political science perspective, political scientists has been struggling how to make the study of politics as a science. I think the especially during the 1960s and 70s, and therefore in political science, we have this philosophy of sciences, and in that the Thomas Kuhn's famous discussion of a paradigm fits right into here. That is during the scientific evolution and or revolution. Usually, at every step, there's being guided or even being limited by a paradigm. And then, but at every paradigm, while it guided, as I said, is also limit how we view, quote unquote, the facts. So one of the famous example is whether the earth is a flat or is round. And in the early days, and it has been considered as a flat, and that is considered as the truth. And so political science during that process is struggling and realize that we have to revisit our assumptions from time to time and make sure that we are not being limited by our assumption or blindly limited by that. So that's when we discuss our, when we teach our students of empirical methodology, and we have to frequently go back and visit our assumptions. I think the 2020 election and also teach political science is a very important lesson is that why our public opinion poll is so way off. I have conversation with some of my colleagues and I think that maybe they want to have a movement and to see try to constitute a commission and to see how we can improve a public opinion poll. What are the assumptions that we have made that are wrong? So I think this fit right into this discussion.
Becky, I would offer that, and I'm looking at your question number 3 here, that with who we are now today, who we have as our students today, I would say, yes, of course, we do need to be agents of change. You know, when we think about the students in our classroom and we're being asked to really see our students and how we teach and how we're present in the classroom and what we teach, does every student in that classroom feel included? Do they identify with the content? So I would say, if we're going to be speaking to all of our students, we have to speak to all of their experiences. So I would say, number 3, yes, we have that obligation.
I agree with you. After prepping these slides, I was just thinking about how pervasive the Mendelian is the foundation of genetics framework is, right? I mean, it's to the point to where when our students take MCAT, take the MCAT, like they know Mendelian genetics through and through. That's how you do well in the MCAT, for example. There are very few questions about epigenetics or there are probably questions about gene expression now, which is kind of the Weldonian idea, is that there's this like complex interaction between genes and the environment. But yeah, I mean, it would just, I guess what I was thinking is that, we really don't have the freedom, biology faculty don't have the freedom to just turn it on its head and teach Weldon first and then Mendel as the exception, right? Because even if we wanted to do that, our students would not be prepared for the world outside of that classroom.
Can I offer an example that we had, and I know Sona and Amy Dennison are on this meeting, I think, and an example we had in social work, a very different discipline, but in social work a couple of years ago. And it was in a human behavior class where we have to teach the seminal theorists of human development, which are, of course, are old dead white men, right? Erikson and Piaget and Kohlberg, et cetera. And we were really hauled up short when in one of our graduate classes, a student said, "I drowned in a sea of whiteness in this class." And so we had a discussion with a faculty member who's white and male. And he said, but what can I do? I have to teach the seminal theorist. I mean, you have to have this, right? We said, of course, teach that. But there's lots of literature out there now that comes from a critical perspective of critiquing from a feminist perspective or from a critical race theory perspective. And does it's kind of a well-rounding of those theories now in terms of how are they seen and moved further now with more contemporary ideas.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I love the term well-rounding, because we don't want to throw Mendel out, right? I mean, he was revolutionary in what he discovered, especially given the technology at the time. Like, he didn't even know what a chromosome was. But yeah, putting it all in perspective, similar to how, you know, in the 1950s, when DNA structure was developed, there was this modern synthesis of evolutionary and genetics ideas.
And James Watson had a very low opinion of the intelligence of Africans. So that says something. So, hey, Becky, I got a question for you. You know, looking at the laudable goal of number 3, and, you know, and I'm also thinking of Stephen Jay Gould's great book on the mismeasures of man, talking about, you know, how science has reinforced racist and misogynist falsehoods. But I'm also thinking about the context in which we live, in which there's rampant denial of climate change, basic recommendations of science regarding COVID-19 and so on and so forth. So how do we balance sort of between reflecting on the fact that science is culturally laden in ways you've expressed and written about in your article, but yet not reinforce the view that basically science is all, you know, kind of a social construct. It's fiction. It's just a theory. Right. I choose not to believe that theory, and therefore, you know, science be damned. So how do we find a balance between?
That's an awesome question. You're like getting at two of my like seemingly polar opposite research agendas, actually. Like, because you referenced the paper that I sent you beforehand, but you know, I also study science denial, and I think what it really boils down to is understanding the process of science. You know, there is not, there is this belief in the general public, like out in the wild, that science is a collection of facts, right? And if those facts are not borne out to be true, then science must be BS. Right? And that's how people arrive at science denial, is that they think of science as a collection of facts. And when we teach it as a collection of facts, we reinforce that. So, you know, the solution, in my opinion, is to teach the process of science, as Ben was talking about. But, you know, you do so in such a way that acknowledges that scientific knowledge is tentative. It's always up for revision given new evidence, but because there's this constant like matching the knowledge with the evidence, or the attempt to do that across the entire community, across the entire scientific community, then it's the best we got. It's still the evidence that is collected and constantly coming in, so that we have constant opportunity to revise what we think based off of new knowledge, new information. That's still better than what your Uncle Joe tells you over the Thanksgiving dinner table. It's still better than any claim that's based off of faith and not observation. It's the best we got. And even though it's tentative, it's always evolving because it's so up to date. So, I mean, I think that's the gist of it, is that you acknowledge the tentativeness of science in how you teach, but you frame the tentativeness of scientific knowledge as a good thing, not a bad thing.
Excellent, thank you, Becky.
You know, I was going to say too that sometimes I think thinking about science within other contexts like history or English or something, because I do a lot of work on World War II and the rise of penicillin, which made all the difference in the survival rate of so many military personnel was just phenomenal. And, and then connecting it to a lot of it was done in Peoria. I mean, this is a really cool thing, and also thinking about the whole idea of racism affecting how we think about science. The idea of blood transfusion, that undergoes a major change during the war, because for so long, if you were Black, you could only give blood to other Blacks. You could not give them to whites, and that ended up changing during the war. So I mean, I can kind of see how science kind of connects with a lot of other narratives that are going on at the same time.
I think the one thing students have a little difficulty with, though, is something that maybe we take very naturally, just given a lifetime of experience, and that is the whole idea of knowledge being tentative. I think a lot of people want certainty. They want to know exactly how history happened. They want to know, is it troubles? How is it that the experts a week ago said this, but now they say that? It's something that it might be easy to put in the words to communicate, but to get the idea to actually seep into the consciousness of students, that's a little tougher to do.
I agree. I mean, it is hard. I think youth has something to do with it, like not being on the planet long enough to realize that things change over time, and that's like the only constant is change, right? Again, though, I go back to how we teach it. I think if we teach it as a ball of facts that you memorize, then that's how they're going to think of it. And part of it, I think, is also just this, there's a security in being able to say things are black and white, it's this and this, and just helping people be okay with not knowing, which is an idea that is very foreign to our current educational system right now. Since the heavy implementation of standardized testing in the early 2000s, like everything now is much more driven by, is it the correct answer, yes or no, rather than let's be intellectually curious and ask questions. And that's probably one of the biggest differences I see between how K-12 schooling happens now and how I experienced it, 30 years ago. So I don't know. I mean, I think that that just we need to return to this idea of, it's okay to ask questions you don't know the answer to. In fact, that's the foundation of science. Like, you can't do science without doing that. And it's okay to be curious and follow those curiosities and not know for a while and just sit with that feeling of, knowledge being tentative and being okay with it. And not being uncomfortable about it. I mean, I think there's a little bit of that kind of training that needs to happen with students as well. So I am curious if anyone has thoughts about this last one, and what other ways do our disciplines have sociopolitical implications? That research that's being done by Donovan, until he started publishing, I first heard him talk at a conference, and then those two papers came out soon after. And until then, I had never even considered how my genetics instruction would influence students' beliefs about race. And, I'm wondering, what other ways that are we perhaps overlooking that our scientific teaching, our knowledge, our scientific knowledge has implications that are sociopolitical that we may not realize at first.
I think one thing, Becky, and this may not always work, but one thing I think we should be open to is listening to our students in the classroom, and how they're hearing and seeing the lessons in the theories, and perhaps personally challenging it, so that we really indulge in the collaborative learning environment, that we may learn a little bit from our students as well in terms of how this resonates with them.
I think the other thing is that so often I think that our students think, especially with the sciences and mathematics, okay, this is what you learn, rather than, here are things to know about what you're learning and kind of the controversy surrounding them. It's not, I'm not just picking on biology, but I think that students say, okay, hard sciences, okay, I need to memorize these facts and there we go, as opposed to thinking of it more kind of a connection between the sciences, but also, the political context, the historical context, and that sort of thing. Because, well, at least from my perspective, and my guess is from the perspective of a lot of students who don't want to be science majors, but if they knew more about how this stuff came about, rather than just the facts, so to speak, surrounding the information that they're getting, I honestly think they would probably find it more interesting.
Sally, wouldn't it be so much fun to have a symposium around some scientific interest and have it be entirely cross-disciplinary, with a political scientist there and a sociologist there and an historian there and a philosopher there, and really dig into it? Wouldn't that be just a barrel of monkeys?
I think that would be cool. And I think some of the IDS minors are trying to get at that, because, you think, okay, well, there's a new minor in food studies, and okay, you think food, but, are we talking it from like a family and consumer science point of view? Are you talking about it from like, fine cuisine? Are you talking about it from the kinds of, water resources that are required to grow wheat or soybeans or corn or whatever? I think there's, it sort of bounces off each other. And I think that's where it's most interesting, because, anytime you teach, and it doesn't matter what discipline we're coming from, the whole idea is a student says, I heard about that in this other class. Oh, and I'm making the connection. And that's, regardless of what kind of a teacher you are, that's what you live for.
Yeah, well, we political scientists, we can turn the world upside down. Yeah, that's for sure.
Haven't you already?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. I'm flattered.
Drop the mic, Sally. Yep, absolutely. Touche.
Kind of piggybacking on what Diane said about social work and, the dead white men. I was on a different webinar earlier today about how mandated reporting in social work is a way to survey Black and Brown and people of color. And they were really challenging the idea around social work kind of emerging from like a white savior ideology, and really kind of investigating Jane Addams, who we all know as the founder of social work, and how she, created some of these systems that now have these negative implications for people of color. And so I think those are the conversations that, at least in social work, we have to have in the classroom. That, for so long we've kind of raised social work up as this helping profession, but that there's also these negative implications of being a social worker, and where does that come from, and what's our history in social work. And so having those critical balances between the two of what social work can bring, but also where does social work come from historically.
And Amy, I'm going to say once again, some of you might have followed a little bit of a chat discussion, and I'm going to say once again, we can only do that through an historical lens,
right?
Socio-political as well, but an historical lens.
Mm-hmm. And it's a tough conversation to have when you're, critically assessing your founders.
Yep.
But isn't it more fun to find out that they aren't perfect people, and we're all just kind of basking in their shadows, as opposed to that there were biases and there's all sorts of problems. Mm-hmm. But I think that makes it more interesting for students, and also just more interesting to kind of question what's going on. Because, there's, I recently read an article by a Portuguese scholar, but it was using a social work lens to look at a novel by Sinclair Lewis. And I thought, okay, now this is really cool, because it's providing some kind of historical perspective, but it's also providing kind of a global perspective. And it was just fascinating.
Sally, you just did a talk at a conference that was What was the talk that you did? It was at a science conference, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. I was speaking on Sinclair Lewis's Aerosmith, which the last part of it deals with the plague in a Caribbean island, and also the main character is in public health prior to that. And so I was paired with somebody who wrote for an article for JAMA, and we were discussing how the literature, and that novel was from 1925, but how that literature helps to kind of make us think about ways in which people affected, how the language about plague and public health really hasn't changed all that much. It was really frightening. They were talking about masks back then, and about, you know, whether or not to have trials even during the plague, so that they could make sure that the vaccine was appropriate and so forth. We had hundreds of people from all over the country at it. It was very cool.
Many of you here are going to be here in the College of Arts and Sciences long past me. And if there's one thing I hope we keep on evolving, is really embracing our interdisciplinarity, because it's only from this wide angle lens that we can do this. We can interrogate, we can ask the questions we don't see from our own discipline. To me, it's the future of the arts and sciences.
And this is what I was going to follow up and say. And I think especially that question 5 and what we've talked about is actually facing some of this head on, actually having the discussion, actually bringing up some of these difficult topics, such as the ones that come up through that question 5, actually maybe having a gen ed class about it and having our science majors take that. So I could see we could have a pair of courses. We could have one which is the history and philosophy of science, and then the other could be just focusing biology right now. You could biology and ethics. You could have a biology and ethics class where you're discussing kind of not only some of these problems of some of the things that we do know actually occur in biology, but how much of that should we apply to humans? And then likewise, some of the things that, you know, things problematic like cloning, let's discuss the science side of that. Let's discuss the actual like society implications of that as well. And I think that sort of thing would be really nice. And I'd hope it would actually potentially encourage our students to discuss also when we get back to just focusing on the science part of it. They're actually encouraged to think critically and discuss those topics as well.
Serendipity, we are actually reviewing our Gen Ed curriculum right now, aren't we, Sally?
Oh, we certainly are, and I'm on the task force. I mean, this is making me excited, because, you know, for years I've been saying, you know, there's nothing wrong with like intro to biology and intro to physics and intro to chemistry, but if I'm not going to be a science major, it just sounds like kind of more of what I did in high school. And people take it, and I know that there have been a couple of studies, and it was actually focusing on ISU students, and they did a pre and post test, and many of them were less interested in science after taking the course than before it, which is really sad. but
after teaching Bio 101 for years, if I taught like a combo history and ethics in the context of biology, I could teach more biology content in that class than I could in Bio 101, because the history and the ethics questions are what suck students in and get them super excited. And then it's like, once they're engaged, feed them the biology, and, you know, and they learn more biology as a result too.
Well, then they learn why biology is important. I mean, because that's kind of it. I mean, you know, if you're thinking, I mean, I'm thinking just like right now with the new vaccine that's being developed for COVID, you know, who gets the vaccine? I mean, that's a question of ethics. It's a question of supply and demand. So we're talking about economics as well. I mean, you know, students, I'm sure, are concerned about who gets the vaccine, but, you know, how that comes to be beyond the biology and sort of surrounding it, I think is what would make it absolutely fascinating for students. You know,
it's socioeconomic, because what regions of the country have these super cold storage freezers? Right. If you're in rural Oklahoma, you don't have one of those, you know?
I was reading a science article that came out this morning about the Pfizer announcement, and they were talking about the ethics of, you know, all of those people who participated in the trial, tens of thousands of people who received a placebo, once we know that there's a workable vaccine, do we then give them the placebo, or do they not receive it so that they can continue to be the control group so we can look at long-term effects of the vaccine? And so, I mean, these are like real-time ethical questions that, students, I think, would be so intrigued to discuss them and to talk about. Think of how much experimental design you could teach through that ethical problem. I don't know, it's just super exciting to me.
This sounds like so much fun. I may not want to retire. How about you, Sally?
Yeah, this is the stuff I'm really most interested in, because how things relate to each other is what I find most fascinating. And the context to me is just, oh, this happens, but nothing happens in a vacuum. And I think the more that we realize it, and the more that students see that, rather than seeing all these discrete disciplinary courses, I think they will actually be better informed and more thoughtful about the world in which they live. So I can give up the rest of my job and just concentrate on gen ed? Is that what you're saying, Diane?
No. How about other questions for Becky? We've got just a couple more minutes here on a lovely Friday. I was telling Becky before the rest of you chimed in, we were in a little bit early, and I was telling her that we started these doing the professional development in early September. We had some really good attendance at the first one, and then good attendance, but I've seen it go down a little bit. But this is excellent attendance, and I would say, Becky, that this is really interesting discussion. This is really creative discussion. It's not just what you provoked in us, but then it's where we have taken it and run with it in terms of maybe some of our own future development here. So maybe your talk today is not just educational, but maybe it's transformative.
I hope so. I would love to see a history of biology or like a cross-disciplinary class.
So there's nothing like that now? I mean, I know that math a couple years ago just developed a history of mathematics course, and I'm kind of stuck.
No, philosophy does have a philosophy of science class. But I think it's a 300 level, and I have encouraged my graduate students to take it before, but I don't think that it would probably be, I don't know what the prerequisites are. I don't know how open it would be to biology majors undergrad.
Yeah, our new early modern Europe historian, Keith Plymers, he has history of science, scientific revolution in his classes. And I mean, he does a really good job, I think, at drawing students in, tying in the environment, kind of contemporary issues into his teaching. So I think, yeah, if we could get one of the reasons I think the department was interested in a history of science position is that it would really complement what Keith's doing and kind of build on that, along with what's in the philosophy department too. So you could really get kind of a mass going of this area that we've been talking about. It could really take off, I think.
Yeah. And it could be very contemporary too, I think, Ross, in terms of how students are thinking more synthetically. And I'm thinking about like Keith, John Kostelnik's on our grid here, and John's the chair of geography, geology, and environment. I think I said those, I may not have said those in the right order, John. But Keith would, the cross-disciplinary work, in fact, I know Keith and Alec have met and have talked to each other before, Alec Foster. But there could be so many fun potentials there. We've got about 5 minutes. If I could mention something to you folks, you're all from College of Arts and Sciences, don't want anybody to run with this or anything, but just in an explorative way, I've had a discussion with the folks from the Center for Water Sustainability. I've had a discussion with Rachel from the Conservation Biologist. I'm meeting with John and his faculty next week to talk to them, particularly the folks in the environment. to see if we want to look at anything cross-disciplinary, which could be wide open, big playground to play in, with some of the folks in College of Applied Sciences and Technology, because they have their renewable energy major over there. They have environmental health. So we just, you know, one of the things we notice is we're so siloed in our colleges, and that's just not how we need to prepare students for the future. So we're going to just have this open brainstorming meeting at some point in the future about, is there anything we can all do together? That's kind of the stuff that could really be fun to play in a sandbox with. Anything else for Becky?
Thank you all for coming. I know it's a really busy time.
This was exceptional, Becky, and as you know, Denise asked us to give permission to Zoom, so we'll put it up on our website and really promote it with other folks. You've really, I think, inspired us to think about how we serve our students that we have right now. So I greatly appreciate this. I'm going to make an advertisement, a plug. Right after this, we have one of our own scholars doing a discussion with the Afro-American Studies program. Greg Braswell is going to talk, and some of us are going to hop into that discussion. So if you were interested in that and didn't sign up for it, you could just email Denise and she'll send you the link. We have a lot of, but we're not Friday. We are not closed on Fridays. We still do a lot of teaching and learning on Fridays.
Yep.
So
Yep. Let me know if you want the link.
thank you all. Thanks, Becky, so much.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.